thank you, all three of you, for these very concise summaries of your work, but even more importantly, for the more substantial pieces that you've contributed to this project. And I have to say, being a part of this project over the past several years, I also just want to thank you for the intellectual strength and sense of steadfastness that you all have shown as you have yourselves grown in the process of, as theologians and historians, writing these pieces. So there's a lot of work underneath what is presented today that is perhaps in its process as important as the substance of what one has achieved, because it could be that this process of reflection in terms of how it unfolded points us on the path of the future rather than with respect to our specific conclusions. What I would like to do is first just say a quick word about why I think this project as a whole is so distinct and so important for our present day. And to put it in a sum is, I think, one of the greatest risks in our culture right now that the church faces, indeed our religious traditions face, is our understanding of the imaginative frames that hold our thought and practice. And what this project attempts to do is to say that the materiality of our everyday life, and in this case, the technologies that we use to mediate and frame our experience, are themselves not just tools, but tell a particular kind of story. And I'm most interested at the end of the day at what the theological conversation, the imaginative frames we bring from our traditions, show us on the map of communication about who we are when we understand the effects and the reach of social media. So the question is, what does theology bring to this? Not just in terms of turning the lens on how we read it, but giving us a new frame culturally for how we might think about what is happening in our information technology and normative frame shift. We are running a series here at Union on economics and theology. And the premise behind this series is that what's happening now in our economic theory is not just a matter of theologians taking economic theory and applying it to the ethics part of a theological project, but that theologians may in fact bring to the whole understanding of how we imagine what an economy is a different set of questions, and hence tell a different story about our economic life together. I think a similar thing is happening in the context through this project in new media. So to begin with the three presentations today, Jim, your discussion of the models of the church, I think, is provocative and comprehensive with respect to the different models it identifies as intersecting in the practices of the churches and communities that were studied. I find myself, however, listening to these and coming up once again with a new set of questions that pushes the conversation, I think, to a next step, questions that you yourself have considered in the process of formulating these. For instance, church as institution, church as mystical community, church as herald that tells the story, church as servant that does justice. So church as institution, that is the structure, the community that is being together, the telling the story, the doing the good. Where in this mix is the church understood as a social movement? Church reconfigured outside the terrain of the different functions or identities that presently live within community. And I've been particularly compelled by the work on social movements that has emerged around, for instance, Occupy Wall Street, the understanding of social movements that we saw manifest in the use of new technology in Obama's campaign, and in the world of community organizing, the shifts that are taking place from an Olinsky model to a new model that has at its heart a digitized understanding of how people are mobilized and formed. I think there's something about mobility that sits at the heart of this digitized understanding of knowledge and social media that may perhaps put on the map an entirely new frame for thinking about church. Secondly, I found myself wondering about this connection that you often hear traveling down through the annals of history in terms of theological history, this distinction between the visible and the invisible church. that was always premised upon an understanding of the church as a set of physical bodies and physical buildings. And the invisible church identified what church was like in God, or the church from God's perspective, the ideal church that existed in the realm that was abstracted from the physical reality of what it is in our present lived moment. Well, is there a way in which the communities that we're describing in some sense have occupied the space of the invisible church? And if that is the case, does this shift in, how to put it, the invisible church has now become connected in inextricable ways to the visible church? What new understanding of the invisible church might it give us? Or another way of putting this is the church as it exists in the cloud 500 years ago would have been the invisible church. But what is the invisible church of the cloud? One way to ask that question. And then I think I would just, in terms of taking this further, the question is the task of the church at the end of the day, its nature, its four features, really the same, just in new forms or pressures? And I call to mind the questions that are raised in an interfaith context, or the questions that are being raised by the unaffiliated. Again, all of these have been named, but is what's happening in the space of social media allowing the emergence of something that is in fact truly new, not just respect to what we understand to be the body of the church, but the very definitions we use to track it. I am reminded of the fact that in your third category of the church, Dullus's church as herald, the whole notion of church as the church that proclaims is a Reformation creation. That as a principal mark of the church did not exist until 500 years ago. Not that there was no preaching, but as a central category. So I found myself wondering, well, what is the proclamation, as an example, to come with respect to those identifying categories? Monica, there can be no more provocative image probably to come out of this whole project. And I remember the first time I heard it than to see a rooter coming down from the ceiling and asking, is this God? Is this Jesus? Can this save us? And I have to admit, the first time I heard you do this presentation, I was like, oh no, of course not. And it's designed to be provocative, but as I listened and read this last time around, here 2 years on the path of using social media, it had an impact upon me that it did not have initially, with respect to the truth that it points to. And I think at the end of the day, what you're describing in terms of salvation, both as mediator and as liberator, are ways that point to, in fact, how traditional many of the uses of social media are. Because you could, in each of these instances, instead of saying social media, you could say, in Reformation terms, well, the Bible was that mediator that allowed healing to happen, that allowed community to be formed. That in terms of liberation, you could ask what other mechanisms in the history of the church have been the place in which the activity of God's saving work is enfleshed. For me, the really interesting question becomes, have the actual God functions changed? So not the question is a social media mediating and liberating, but does it give us, in this turn of frame, a whole other set of categories for imagining the work of God in the world? Have the God functions changed? Do we have, for instance, a different view of Jesus and of a body and of history that is coming into being that will change our understanding of what Jesus is as historical and present? And your own work pushes in that direction, but let me just pause here and say one thing that I was particularly struck by is how much in our traditional soteriological categories the work of God in the world has assumed a stable notion of time and space. And what does it mean when time and space itself gets reconfigured? And this leads me then, Lerone, into comments about your wonderful set of stories that bring us back into history, and by taking us back, show us, in fact, how substantial the changes can be in the heart of what a theology is when these categories are transformed. In Whitefield, you talk about questions of temporal extension and how history itself, or narrativity, changes. In the example of Ben Etten, we get questions about how body changes. And in the story of the radio, we get serious questions about democracy and community. And in this context, I'll use it here in conclusion to just gesture in the direction of what I think are some of the substantial questions that the next phase of the project, and I think as I have window peeked into these conversations, you all are already engaging, but questions like this. In the instance of Whitefield, Whitefield was first and foremost an actor, a performer. What does it mean if new media is in fact the theater? And how does that then change the way we think of God acting in the world and the theater of our lives? The notion of history as it changes is a very practical question I have. I'm aware that as I lead an institution and we move to a model of the cloud as the space of our archive, what does that do to our understanding of the materiality of history when it is all collapsed in a space that we never touch? It doesn't just change the way we think about our own bodies, but the very way we conceptualize what a tradition is if it's instantly compressed and abstracted. So what is an archive, and how is that tied to a tradition? What does it mean to say Jesus was historical? And then finally, the question of power. And I think what we're seeing right now in the use of social media in many political contexts will press the church to think about the limits and the constraints and the scope of democracy. I come from a very low church tradition where we discuss endlessly as a community all features of church doctrine and church life. But what does it mean if the church, in the model of social media, is increasingly pulled into the space of public consensus about divine truth? Does that mean then that the space of the church's truth-giving is ultimately open to collective determination? If we're moving in that direction, I think we will find ourselves at some point thrown back upon those historical moments in which the church itself, even in its most democratic moments, has been ambivalent about what that means for understandings of the relationship of God to the world. So, this is a wonderful project. I think as we pull out from the case studies and begin to organize as theologians at a seminary, I'm interested about the books that will come from this, picture books, the resources that will be online. But I think along with that are these questions. What are the categories to follow? What will be proclamation? What will we understand to be the nature of suffering, of knowledge? Indeed, looking back to liberation theology, which depends upon a notion of history and classes, what do we do as history itself is collapsed and the notion of a social unit is changed? I think that raises really important political questions which run through all of these about how we imagine what the work of God in the world in terms of social justice is. So thank you all. This project has been wonderful to be housed at Union, and of the many delights that have come with this is I can remember very clearly 5 years ago, before this project was in its full form, sitting in James Chapel and seeing for the first time in the middle of a panel discussion, seeing somebody tweeting. And then to hear that someone was up there tweeting away the events that were happening, like, my God, what new age have we moved into? And that person is sitting right back there tweeting right now. That is Tony. You were doing it. So you always remember where you were when you first saw. Well, it was in the moment of this conversation. So thank you all.